maybe we should just get going. I think it'll just start growing from here.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Jean, for taking time out of your busy remote working schedule. Just to give some context on why we're doing this and what this actually is. So Trusted Interns is an organization with a purpose to help unemployed youth get their first job with great companies. And since COVID-19 has become a reality world round, remote working has become almost a requirement for most organizations. And because we've had to do it for so long, it's essentially becoming a standard. And we anticipate that post-COVID, remote working will be, I wouldn't say the norm, but it will definitely be much more relevant, and more organizations will be open to hiring remote talent going forward. However, we also know that there's a lot of people out there who just don't know what they're doing, and they don't know what to expect, and they're not too sure how to prepare, because either working from home or a coffee shop or a shared workspace, or whatever it may be, working from somewhere that isn't in a normal office environment is new. And we've got Jean here who's going to help us walk through that. So just some context on Jean. He is the engineering manager for Gitlab. Gitlab is an international organization with over 1,200 employees in 65 countries, and they don't have a single office. So every single one of those 1,200 employees is working remotely. And Jean has a background of working both in an office for a number of years and now working remotely, even before it was a requirement with COVID. So Jean is one of our trusted mentors, and he's here to share his wisdom with our community and beyond. And we're really excited to have this conversation. Just some quick house rules. They're very simple. I'm going to hand over to Jean to give a more comprehensive introduction to himself. And also just give us a very quick presentation on his journey and how he has navigated his career from a formal office environment to a remote working environment. And then we've also received quite a few questions from our community leading up to this, which we have collated into a list. But you can also feel free to ask questions via the Facebook comments. In fact, please do. But once Jean's done with his presentation, I'll ask him some of the questions we've already been sent, but we'll also start to ask him some of the questions from the community. Jean, thanks again for being here, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Jared. Hello, everybody. So as Jared mentioned, I'm Jean du Plessis. I'm one of the engineering managers at Gitlab. I joined Gitlab, well, a little bit about Gitlab first. So as Jared mentioned, we have close to 1,300 people actually around the world now, spread across 68 countries. It grows every week, so it's difficult to keep up with the numbers. But as you can see, we're distributed all over the world, and we don't have a single office. Our CEO works from his apartment, and our registered address is a post box in San Francisco. So we stumbled into remote work. Gitlab has been doing it for over 5 years now. When they got early funding, the investors told them, look, you're going to have an office for your salespeople and so on. But they soon realized that, because they were used to working remotely, people just stopped coming to the office. And soon they decided there's no use to have an office. And so what GitLab has done is they didn't wake up one day and just have all the answers to remote work. They went through trial and error, made a lot of mistakes, and they're sharing today the best practices that they've learned to make remote working successful. Because remote working isn't without challenges. There are challenges with it, especially if you have team members across pretty much every single time zone. That's a big challenge. But there's lots of ways you can mitigate these challenges and have a really successful organization. So I joined GitLab in July of 2019. So I've been working remotely for just under a year now. It was my first remote position. And before then, I worked for almost 16 years in an office. It was it was my norm. I commuted to the office, initially by train and then by car later in my career, and it was what I was used to. And as I progressed in my career and became a manager, a lot of my techniques was based on being present with my team, being able to pull people into a room, have a conversation with them, whiteboard ideas. That was how we used to working. So when I was applying at GitLab, I had a lot of doubt. I was wondering, how can I effectively manage individuals when I'm not in the same room with them? Would I get lonely working from home? Would I miss an office environment and communicating with teammates? And how would they know if I performed well? If they can't see what I'm doing, if they can't see me there, how would they know what I'm doing? And how would we have effective meetings if we're all in different locations? So I had a lot of doubts, and I went through a journey of researching a lot of these challenges. I spoke to a friend who worked remotely for a few months before, and I decided to take the plunge. Since then, I am happy to report that I have learned a lot, and my doubts have gone away. I have a much better work-life balance. I'm happier overall. I'm not lonely at all, and I'm more productive. I'm having just as good, if not better, relationship with my team members. And personally, I feel like I've become a better manager as I'm less inclined to micromanage because my team members aren't sitting around me. So for me personally, the journey has been really positive. If you want to talk about some tangible benefits, I did a calculation last night, and to date I've saved 352 hours of travel time, which is essentially 14 and a half days that's been given back to me for free, something that I have been able to use for either to spend with family or to do some self-improvement. I've also saved quite a lot of money just in fuel. 940 liters of fuel at the price of when I started working remotely is almost 15,000 Rand. And so that's a lot of money. And I've had more time to spend with my wife, children, and friends, leading to improved relationships with them. And I've had flexibility to adapt to life's needs. If I needed to go somewhere quickly in the morning to go pick up a package, or need to run an errand, I could quickly do that. And that's been really great. But that's enough about me and a quick intro. Let's get into some of the questions. I'll try and answer them to best of my ability.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. That was a great intro, and I think it will provide context to our viewers on really all the different moving parts. I think you've covered it quite holistically. You've covered the office environment, you've covered your personal lifestyle, the benefits, but also some of the challenges. So when we launched this webinar to our community a few days ago, we did get some questions in, as I mentioned. So I'd like to go through some of those if you don't mind. But we also do have someone in our team pinging us with any other questions that come through, either via our website on the online chat or via Facebook. But one of the questions that interested me the most was, we know working in the youth space specifically, that there's often a misalignment of expectations between the employer and the individual, because oftentimes employers have, I'd say, a greater expectation of their first-time job seekers, particularly because they just want them to hit the ground running, and not everyone's geared up to do proper training and onboarding and that kind of thing. And that was a challenge as is in normal office environment. And now if we look at the remote environment, what are how do the expectations of employers differ in terms of onboarding remote talent as opposed to their expectations if they were onboarding talent in their physical office space?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things at GitLab that we specifically look out for is somebody's capability to work remotely when we interview them. We've got various ways to do that. But I've got a few things that I'd highlight in that sense. I think the first thing is self-discipline. You need to be self-disciplined. you're not going to have the office routine of like needing to wake up at a certain time to make sure you're in the office at a certain time. And so you need to have the self-discipline to keep that routine going. You need to figure out what your routine is. You need to and have that self-discipline to keep going. So that's something that's really important. You also need to be self-motivated. If you're in an office environment and you're surrounded by coworkers, there's this perceived pressure. Your manager can see what you're doing, your peers can see what you're doing. So there's a pressure of you need to be working. But when you're remote, nobody sees you unless you're on a video call. So you need to be self-motivated to make sure that you get into your work. I think another thing that becomes really important in a remote work is values alignment. From Gitlab's point of view, there's a much bigger focus on being aligned with the company's values. Like we found that employees that are aligned with the values, a lot of the kind of like things that we would want or in somebody that is capable of remote work, comes naturally. And we hire people who have never worked remotely before. I was one of them. And so values alignment is something that is really important. So make sure you're familiar with the company's values, and that they resonate with you at a personal and a professional level. It will just help you adapt so much better in that environment.
Yeah.
Trust is another thing that I think is really important in remote working. Employers place a lot of trust in remote employees. They can't see them. Like the typical way a manager would know whether somebody's working is they're at their desk.
Yeah.
That's the old way of knowing. But so employers place a lot of trust in remote employees, and you need to be respectful of that trust and pay it back. And I think the last thing I would say is that you're much more measured on your outputs than your inputs. Being at the office with your bum on your seat means nothing in remote working.
Yeah.
You might get away with looking present and looking busy in an office environment, but in a remote environment you can't. You will be fully judged on your outputs, which is actually a good thing. I think a lot of people, whether they're office bound or not, should really rather be judged on their outputs than their inputs. So those are the kind of like things I think remote employers are looking differently at when they're hiring talent.
Yeah, that last point of basically expectational management based on output it's something that excites me the most, because we've been huge proponents of that for the last few years. Like it shouldn't make a difference on whether you do your job between 9 in the morning and midnight, or whether you do it between midnight and 5 a.m. or whatever it is, whatever your work style is, you should be given the autonomy to do what you want when you want to do it, as long as you get it done. But I mean, I can imagine like that aligned with your first point, which was discipline, particularly for someone who's never really had a remote job before, can be quite challenging. So what would your advice be to someone who hasn't had a remote job before, and they now want to take the advice that you've just given, because now they know what the expectations of the employers are? How can they prepare? What are the things that they can do to gear up to be ready to tick all the boxes you just mentioned now?
Yeah, I think the first thing you need to do is mentally prepare yourself. When I was preparing to apply to Gitlab, I first had to figure out whether I was comfortable with working remotely.
Yeah.
You need to imagine yourself in a remote environment. What are you uncertain of? And do some research. Speak to other people who are working remotely. Share your concerns with them. See how they are addressing it. So that I think is a good thing. I think in a remote environment, there's a high usage of communication tools. Zoom, Skype, Slack, Microsoft Teams. There's lots of software tools that are being used, and you should make sure that you're familiar with those tools. If you haven't used them before, Start playing around with them. Make sure you're comfortable using them, because it will make your journey into remote so much easier if you're already comfortable with those tools. One thing that really stood out for me in remote working is how much of a focus there is on communicating and writing differently. In an office, there's a lot of shared context that just exists, due to the fact that people overhear conversations in an office and so on. But that doesn't happen in a remote work. So you need to be really deliberate about what you write and how you write it. We know the written form can be really badly perceived sometimes. I can write something and mean it in a certain way, but it can be perceived by somebody else because they're not seeing my body language or picking up on my tone when I'm writing it. So you need to be really deliberate about that, and make sure that when you write something down, whether it's on Slack or whatever tool you might be using, that you're making sure that the person has necessary context, and also that you convey your intention with what you're writing down, so that they don't have to guess, is this person shouting at me? Are they angry? Or are they literally just giving me advice? And lastly, I would say is plan your office space. I think it's really important to have a dedicated space to do your work in. Personally, I'm lucky I have a room with a door that I go into and that I enter my office zone. I've got a desk that I work in, and when I'm done with my day, I try and shut down by when I leave my office. I leave my phone sometimes here, and I try and leave it behind so that I can switch in and out of the work and the home mode, because there is a risk that you can kind of like get too used to just being in your office in the work mode. So that's something to look out for.
So, I mean, I just want to ask quickly, just to settle the minds of everyone out there, because a lot of the tips that you're giving are really valuable, but I can't even write them down as fast as you mentioning them. So will the content that you're discussing right now be available after this presentation? Can we give everyone a list of notes or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. I have written them down on as part of my slide deck, so I'm more than happy to share that afterward, and people can read it. They don't have to try and rush to make notes.
Brilliant.
I will make it available.
So just going back to your last points of professional communication and all the online tools, and you mentioned Slack. I've got a couple of Slack messages coming through from our team. So there's one comment on Facebook that it's a bit of a curveball. I would have no idea how to answer it. Maybe you've had experience with this in the past. So it says, considering the fact that South Africa has load shedding, don't you think working remotely will have an impact on productivity in the long run? I'm asking because most people don't have generators at home. And if something is due urgently, then that will become an issue.
Yeah, I have struggled with load shedding. I've had to cancel meetings, move them out. I was in a meeting during when load shedding started in my area, and I was lucky that our company paid for us to get a UPS to kind of like have some connectivity and stuff. I think one of the benefits of moving, if more employers move remotely, is there'll be less electricity needs. There will be less office buildings that need to be lit up with big lights and stuff, and it might actually have a good impact on our power supply and demand. It is a risk. I think if you're one thing that we have, luckily with load shedding, is it's fairly predictable. There are schedules that are put out, and yes, we might get a notice on the morning that we're starting load shedding, but I think you can prepare for that. And in the South African context, I think most of us are quite used to and familiar with it, and understand if something is wrong. If you're lucky enough to have a laptop, you normally have a little bit of battery power that that might last you through your load shedding 2-hour schedule or whatever it might be, and so that you can still continue working. I think planning ahead for that time that you might be disconnected from the internet, and making sure that you can still work on things. You might be doing some admin during that, or so don't expect that you're going to be on video calls all day in a remote environment.
Yeah.
In fact, that is a small amount of my day. A lot of my day is just working asynchronously, communicating asynchronously with team members. So I think if load shedding becomes a factor again for us, we should be prepared and plan ahead.
Yeah.
Be conscious about the fact that it can disrupt your life.
Yeah. So just to give some context from my side, for that Facebook user who asked the question. So a lot of the employers on Trusted Interns right now are adapting their own working styles and their office space to factor in that they're going to be hiring more remote people. And John, exactly as you said, by having less individuals in offices, we will be in kind of a way decentralizing or at least stabilizing the amount of load on the different grids, which could hopefully help relieve the pressure on Eskom. But what some of the employers are doing, just to give some comfort to the first-time job seekers out there, or the job seekers, is because they have less pressure to have people in their office, and because they know that their staff are now going to be worked in a distributed fashion, sometimes in their own homes, they are rather reallocating budgets to make sure that the individuals are properly set up at home. So we've got a few clients right now who have been hiring constantly through lockdown. Well, not constantly, but they're not slowing down. And they have been shipping out laptops and dongles and UPSs, well, not UPSs yet, but we know that they're open to that, to these individuals at their home. So depending on the company that you work for, just to answer the question, if you are reliant on being online all the time and load shedding is a reality, we're quite sure that they'll take care of you and they'll make sure that you're able to work remotely. So Jean, I mean, I'm reading into that person's question, and I think it's natural for any South African to have a bit of anxiety linked to working at home, just because their circumstances may not be that great. They might not have a private room. They might not have reliable internet or electricity or whatever that may be. And I mean, I can imagine that there's some psychological effects to working remotely. Can you maybe walk us through if you've experienced anything like this, or how does one keep sane if they're working by themselves in their home all day without being around other people?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you should understand, you should get a better insight into yourself. Know whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. Like I'm personally an introvert. Like I'm okay talking to people, doing this conversation with you, but I get tired if I'm among a lot of people. Like being physically with people drain me. Extroverts, they get their energy from interfacing and interacting with people. So if you know you're an extrovert, like you need to compensate for the fact that you're not going to be among a lot of people. So you might want to plan some social activities at night or on the weekends, or you might want to consider working for a few hours from a coffee shop. I do that just to break the monotony of being at home. So on a Friday morning, before lockdown, my routine was to go and sit at a coffee shop, and I would. I have a no meeting Friday policy, and so I use that time to do some admin work, some deep thinking. So I go and sit in a coffee shop, and I don't necessarily need to talk to somebody because I don't have that need, but just the fact that I'm around other people help a lot. There's also other options. There's co-working spaces, which is something that has picked up a lot over the last while, where you can go and you can rent a hot desk, or you can even have a monthly subscription where you have your own office. And a lot of companies are willing to pay for it. At Gitlab, for instance, they understand that the home environment isn't ideal for everybody. You might have a lot of small kids that make it difficult for you, or you might be in a small apartment where you just don't have a room that's dedicated for that. And so I think companies are opening up to the idea of making sure that they can meet the needs of the individual by allowing them to go to a co-working space or even a coffee shop if that's what you need. One thing I personally found in working remotely is that there's a tendency to be more open with communication, because that's the only way you can get context, and so there's a lot of communication streams happening. So in Slack, and what that what we use at work. There's a lot of conversations happening all the time. You can imagine 1,200 people, talking all around the day. There's always something to read. And so information overload becomes a reality, and something that I struggled with in my first month. And slowly I learned what to engage with and what I can leave. So that's something you should watch out for is if you're getting information overload. To make sure you're not busy just being busy by catching up on conversations. It's important to make time to have the conversation catch-ups because it gives you the necessary context, but identify what you need to engage with and what you can ignore. And then one thing, related to communicating is like being comfortable communicating open, and being, I needed to learn that it's better, and Gitlab's policy is to speak in public channels rather than private channels. So instead of sending a DM to somebody, I should rather put it in their team channel, because other people learn from that, and you create a collective kind of like ownership of the knowledge rather than keeping it in between people. And the last thing, and I think I alluded to it earlier, is just switching off. It is very easy to get stuck into an always on mode, because you're at home, your office is at home. So, it's very easy to go into working too much or too long. And, you have to create those triggers that help you switch from home to work. If it's whether it's a separate office that you have where you can have a door that you open and be conscious of when you leave that space, or whether it's a routine, like maybe you start with your morning coffee and you sit and you just like, after that, okay, now I'm going to go into work mode. And then when you're done with work, maybe you have another thing that you do just to help you psychologically adapt to the different modes that you're in.
Yeah. So, I mean, those are all very valuable tips. The one that I've been struggling with personally, and we have a team of like 6 people, so I can't imagine it with being 1,200 people, is that information overload. So, I mean, if you can just analogize that to being in an office environment, first of all, let me just give context to people who are listening who might not know. Slack, which Jean and I have mentioned a few times, is essentially like WhatsApp for business, I guess. It's not WhatsApp for business. It's an online chat tool where it's a completely separate program and it's instant messaging. So you can have different groups and you can have private chats and you can upload files, you can have to-do lists. So I'm thinking of Slack channels as almost being individual offices or boardrooms. And just imagine being in an office with 1,000 people and being a fly on the wall in every single one of those offices, because you technically have visibility into all of them. So the information overload can be real. So Jean, there's a question that's come through from the Facebook page. Less a question, more a statement, but it does feed well into one of the other questions that was asked. So they said, remote working will kill off office politics. A huge plus. Being judged on your productivity rather than any unnecessary things. So, I mean, you've had the experience of 16 years in an office and a year in remote. Can you comment on that? Has it killed off any unnecessary office politics, or does it still exist?
I think it can exist, but I would agree with the statement that it makes it less easy to have office politics. Less, you can still have cliques. You can still have people that only communicate with themselves, and exclude other people. And if you're not consciously inclusive with your communication, you can inadvertently create that office politics.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that remote working has helped is it allows the person that is not the loud voice to be heard. In an office environment where people are co-located, it's normally the people that are comfortable speaking up, comfortable, make a loud noise. They're heard, and they're seen. And so the one that is quiet, the one that is more reserved, is often not noticed in an office environment. Whereas in a remote environment, you're all equal in that sense. Everybody still has the opportunity to be heard. And I think that speaks to getting comfortable with being transparent as well, is speaking up, being comfortable, making a message where 1,200 people are going to see your message, and you might be judged with it. But like hopefully the company creates a culture where it's okay, where you have some psychological safety that you can, you feel it's okay to do that. It's one of the first things I had to adapt to GitLab, is just getting comfortable with this transparency. It was really hard. And so, but now having done it for almost a year, I see its benefit, and I cannot imagine working differently. And slowly I've become more comfortable with it, to the point where I'm embracing it.
Yeah. So, I mean, that leads to another really interesting question, which is, we have found in our process working with employers that you pretty much can't get away from the fact that everyone is looking for a team player. At some point in your career, you could be an individual programmer that's working on your own project, or you could be a customer support consultant who's just responsible for your phone and your list of leads and your list of queries, or whatever they may be. But at some point, you're going to have to work with someone else. And employers often test for this in the interview phases. So they might do a first round interview, which is one-on-one, and then a second round interview, which might be some sort of competency test. And at any point, they might bring a group of individuals together just to see how they work in a team environment. So that's obviously not possible, or it's just not feasible for remote companies. How does teamwork work? How does teamwork work in a remote environment? Or how is it different? Because it still has to be there.
You're right. It has to be there. I think in a remote environment, you probably need to be a little bit more deliberate about teamwork. But I think at its core, the principles of what teamwork is relevant whether you're co-located or remote. So you need to be available. You can be unavailable whether you're sitting next to somebody or 1,000 kilometers away. So just because you're not co-located doesn't mean your teammates don't need you. So make sure you're available. And if you're not going to be available, communicate it. Set the expectation that, hey, I need to focus for a few hours. I'm going to sign off and so on. So being available is important. Being responsive. If you see a need, jump in and help out. It's in a remote environment, it's very easy for somebody to ask a question in the Slack channel and be ignored because nobody's responding to it. So be responsive. And lastly, be inclusive. Just like in a co-located environment, you can be exclusive by not including people in certain activities. Be inclusive in a remote environment. If you're working on something, specifically ask people for feedback. Don't just keep it between you and somebody else. Open it up and say, hey, please give me your feedback. Ask for their input. So if you're making sure you're available, that you're responsive to people's needs, and that you're inclusive in your actions, I think those are the core tenets of teamwork, and that is true for co-located or remote. So I don't think you have to, and employers hopefully looking at it in the same way and saying that, just because somebody isn't physically there doesn't mean they're not a team player.
Yeah.
In fact, the collaboration that I experience in my team is far beyond what I've experienced in any co-located teams. Like, as long as you're open to those principles, I think you can be considered a team player.
Yeah. So thanks for that context. And what we often find, particularly with millennial and Gen Z talent, so the two new generations that are coming into the workforce, is in their expectations or hopes and desires of their workplace, wherever it may be, there's a big conversation always around culture, because people these days want to work for a purpose. They want to work with a team that really has a good vibe, where they feel comfortable and they can be transparent, as you said, and do it comfortably, knowing that they're not being judged, but also so they can have a good time and really just enjoy what they do. So I'm personally, I wouldn't say we're struggling with it, but when we were in an office environment, every now and then we'd just say, okay, cool, let's all go grab lunch. And we'd walk down the road and would get a burger. Or we would walk to the kitchen and get popcorn. or would go get coffee together. So like there was an easy way to interact with your peers, however it may be. So what can remote workers expect from a culture point of view, and from a camaraderie point of view? And is it different? Like, do you lose the cultural element, or do you have any tips on how either an employer or a team can still keep a cool, fun, inclusive culture in a remote environment?
Yeah, I think the one thing that stands out for me is that there's an overemphasis on culture in the workplace. And what I'm saying there is, I'm not saying people should just be robots and so on, but what I've learned, especially in the last year, is values trump culture. You know, if you're going into a company, rather make sure you're aligned with their values, because that is what they, that gives you an insight in terms of how they make decisions, what they value. When the good times dissipate, and there's financial troubles, culture goes out of the window.
Yeah.
There's no free drinks, there's no popcorn. The coffee machine gets shut down. But values bond people together, in the good times and the bad times. So I would say, don't focus much on the culture, focus on the values. I have found that I've had conversations with people who I cannot imagine having talked to in the past. Somebody in India, somebody in Australia, all over the world. And I've always felt there was a connection with them because I know, we shared something in the values. Gitlab is really, specific about interview process that we hire according to values. We have score sheets where you specifically rate people on the values and so on. So I know that any one of my team members, out of the 1,200, there's something that I'll have in common with them because we're hired based on value interest. The other thing that I would say is, like, just because you're not co-located doesn't mean you can't have great camaraderie. Personally, I've been part of where we had team days, where for a whole day, we would have various sessions, whether it's playing Counter-Strike online against each other, or it's a silly online drawing game called Drawsaurus, where you get a word and you draw it with your mouse, and your team members need to guess it and stuff like that. And it was great fun. We loved it so much that we've now made it a quarterly thing. We had a virtual pizza party before, so everybody ordered pizza. We jumped on a Zoom call. We ate pizza together and we chatted. And to be honest, I didn't miss the fact that I couldn't touch the person or anything, and they weren't a meter away from me. And then another thing which GitLab does really well is they really encourage social calls. So we call them coffee chats, and people are encouraged to just schedule them randomly. Even as part of your onboarding, it's mandatory to have at least 5 coffee chats with somebody outside of your team. And those are just social chats, and you're getting to learn more about people. I've learned so much about people's cultures, their countries, their backgrounds, and it's been amazing. And I've really enjoyed that process as well. So yes, you can still have great camaraderie. You need to be more intentional about it, because yes, you're not all of a sudden going to find yourself surrounded by everybody in the kitchen. So you need to be a little bit more deliberate and plan it and so on, but you can still have a great culture. But I would say, rather have a culture be influenced by your values than just looking for the culture thing.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, we preach to our clients all the time that they should be hiring to their values. And if you hire to your values, and you onboard to your values, and you manage to your values, and you onboard clients based on your values, if you align everything around your values, then that's a very easy way to make sure that everybody and every single stakeholder is on the same page. But you mentioned something in that last answer about onboarding, and you said that you guys have to at least 5 coffee chats in your onboarding. And there's someone in the engineering space that's put a comment on the Facebook page. So I'm going to read it to you, and it actually does align quite well with one of the other questions that was sent to us before we started. So this person said, for me personally, in fact, what this is very specific for Jean is interns. So if we must remember that a large amount of our community of trusted interns are unemployed youth looking for their very first job. So what this person says is, for me personally, I think remote working makes it harder for interns to settle in. For example, interns aren't properly walked through what they need to do. I experienced this where it took me 2 weeks to understand what my role in DevOps teams were because my manager was just too busy to walk me through it. So, I mean, this just speaks to the fact that first-time job seekers need guidance. You can't just hire them, plonk them in a seat, whether it's remote or in an office, and just expect them to fly. It just doesn't work like that. They need to be nurtured because they've just got no experience. So what can they do as a first-time job seeker to make sure that they can still get this when working remotely? And conversely, and we can also discuss this in our next webinar series, which is more focused on the employer side, what can the employers do to make sure that they're actually onboarding entry-level talent properly, even though they're not in the office environment?
Yeah, so that's a really good point you make there. I was part of a working group at Gitlab at the end of last year where we established our first all remote engineering internship. Even though we were doing remote for a long time, we didn't have a remote internship, and so we created this pilot. We did some research. We spoke to other companies who were doing all remote and who've tried internships, and they had a high failure rate in their mind based on the experience they had. And so it really is a challenge, and it's something that can only be overcome if both the job seeker and the employer kind of want to make it work. So we were really deliberate in making sure that we're doing everything we can to set our interns up for success. We've got 4 interns currently being part of our pilot, and we created a whole program for them. We have what we call an onboarding buddy, so somebody who is dedicated to helping them navigate the first few days at work. We've created a very clear cadence of recurring meetings where they, as interns, meet together just to discuss challenges they're having, but also where they're having meetings with mentors in their team and with their manager. So there's regular meetings, and also what we've had training to the teams who are hosting an intern to make sure that they know what to expect. A lot of them have forgotten what it was to enter your first day in employment. The fear you have, the uncertainty. So there's a lot that really has to be done from the employers, and as you mentioned, we can get into that in another webinar. But from the perspective of the employee side and as an intern, I think what you should do is set the expectation up front. Make sure that there is an understanding of who and when you can reach out to for help. You will get to a point where you're stuck, where you don't know because you're just not going to know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And you need to be comfortable to speak up. Don't suffer in silence. If the worst thing you can do is to not speak up, and because you don't want to look weak, or you don't want to ask for help because people might judge you. Yeah. That is the worst thing you can do, and that's something we're really making sure that interns know, that we might not be able to answer you immediately, but you have just put your question out there.
Yeah.
At least. So set an expectation up front. Make sure that you know who you can reach out to, and speak up when you're stuck.
Well, that's really great advice. And I mean, one of the things that we know that employers have issue with is the work readiness of individuals who are first-time job seekers joining their team. So these are just, the basic essential skills like time management and professional communication and workplace etiquette and things that many people who've been in the workplace for many years kind of take for granted because they've picked up those skills as they go along. But if we're frank with each other, we know that the education system in South Africa doesn't always equip youth with those essential skills and whatnot to be prepared for the workplace. But I'm quite interested to talk about one in particular, which is workplace etiquette, because that's often one of the big stumbling blocks. Like either there's cultural differences, or there's work style differences, or there's just difference in backgrounds. Is workplace etiquette remotely as much of a challenge as workplace etiquette in the office, or is there a difference? Like how, just what is that? What does that look like? And just maybe give us some feedback based on your experience.
Well, I guess the simple answer is, in reality, it's not the same. You know, no one sees below the camera. You don't know if I'm wearing pants today, but just for the record, I am. No one knows whether you brush your teeth or took a shower before you started work. Nobody will know if you're eating at your desk, or if that's something that's not allowed in the office space. So in reality, it is different. However, I think you need to be respectful to your colleagues and your clients, both in the way you dress, the way you talk, you present yourself. You will benefit by sticking as close as possible to routine and behavior that you might have had in a physical office space, just due to that psychological conditioning it gives you. So one of the first tips I got about remote working was, make sure you do the basics. Make sure when you go and shower, you brush your teeth, get dressed, comb your hair, those kind of things.
Yeah.
It just conditions you to get into that work mode. And so, yeah, in reality, it is different, but at the same time, it's not as well. And being respectful is really important in that sense.
Yeah, I think the one thing that hits home the most with what you just said there is routine. So oftentimes people say routine sets you free. It sounds counterintuitive, but having a routine that is kind of stable and you know exactly what's going to happen when, gives you that freedom to do whatever you want outside of that routine. And I can appreciate that, whether you're working remotely or whether you're working in the office, establishing that routine that works for you is what's important. So, I mean, just there's a lot to take in that what you've just said here, and I appreciate that you're going to share this, all this information that you've just said. We'll put it into a nice deck and we can upload it to the Trusted Intern site, and we'll make it available for download to anyone anybody who wants it, really. But are there any other resources like that you know of that individuals can like maybe watch an online video or do like a quiz or anything that can help them better prepare for when they first get that remote job? Because the reality is, we're not going to ignore it. Remote jobs are going to become more and more and more relevant for everyone. And as humans, we need to progress ourselves and adapt ourselves to get there. So what else can they do that can better prepare them for getting that first job?
Yeah, so I'm going to share the screen again.
Yeah, go for it.
And just cover some things. So Gitlab has gathered a lot of remote knowledge over the years, most of it through trial and error. And we're actually at a point where we've got somebody who's our head of remote, Darren Murph, and he, his whole job is to just focus on this thing. And him and a lot of the team members have put this amazing resource called the Remote Playbook together. And you can go to our website and download it. There's in-depth articles on many topics, both from the employer side as well as the employee. I've put a link here, bit.ly/all-remote-playbook, and that will take you to this page where you can download it. And really, if you go and you read through all of these materials, it will give you a good understanding of remote. In fact, I think in terms of helping you prepare, I mentioned earlier that mental preparation, doing and reading is vital and something you have to do. And the last thing that I'm really excited about is Gitlab has actually just a few days ago, started making a remote work foundation certification available. And we'll share the link again, but if you want to take it down, it's bit.ly all-remote certification, and it's free. All you have to do, if you need, there's 10 kind of like content sections that you go through. You read the content, you do a little assessment, which is just a Google form. if you pass the assessment, you get a completion certification. If you pass all of the 10, you'll get a certificate of completion. And
brilliant.
I think this is a great signal to prospective employers that you're serious about remote work. You've thought about it. You've done your research, and even better, I think you might be able to help your prospective employer get better at remote work.
Yeah.
I think remote work is something a lot of people are coming to grips with. And if you can learn from the 5+ years or so of Gitlab's mistakes and lessons that we learned, and fast track your way into a better remote working, like so much better.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for sharing that. It's definitely something that we'll share with our community. We're all about education, we're all about career progression, and we are very mindful and cognizant of how interlinked education and careers are, or your job is. And anything that we can do to upskill our cohort and our community of job seekers to better prepare them for the workplace is super valuable. So if it's okay with you, we're definitely going to send that link to everyone in our community. And as you said, it can also help the employers better prepare themselves for remote working. So we'll share that with them as well. And hopefully we can unpack that a bit more when we do the employer workshop in the next week or two.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, John. I think that's it's been a fascinating 51 minutes for me personally. I've learned a lot, and I look forward to getting your notes so that we can apply that in our own team locally. And I'm quite confident that everyone who watched this learned a number of things as well. So we're really grateful for your time. Thank you to Gitlab for allowing you to do this and for allowing you to share all these valuable resources, because you guys are 100% seen as, I would say, the leader and the thought leader in remote work internationally. So we're super grateful, and we look forward to the next session with you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Man. Cheers. Chat soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.